Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I would love to encourage everybody, if you're in a position to do so, to come off to turn your camera on. Because I much prefer not speaking into the void. And thanks to Glenn and Kimberly for doing that. And I know we don't have much time, but I would love to take a moment before we start if people would be willing to just share, introduce yourselves and why you chose to attend this session. Because I know it's probably unusual. I often don't get to speak about this with people who are actually in the battery industry, particularly these days. So I'd love to know kind of what your interest is. And maybe Kimberly, if I could put you on the spot to go first.
Sure. I was originally going to go to the one that was announced before you, and hearing what you were talking about, and then I looked into what your interests are and what you do for the circular economy. I am actually a member of the Circular Supply Chain Network, and my focus is on ecosystem building for enhancing circularity and enhancing battery recycling, and it's building all the parts that are around the technology. So I find this very interesting. Some of it is policy, some of it is infrastructure, some of it is the supply chain. So that's what made me very interested in hearing what you're going to be speaking about.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe I'll call on Glenn next, and then actually we may not have enough time to get to everyone else. So if a few more people are interested in sharing, if you could raise your hand, that would be great, or put it in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I chose yours because it kind of matches one of the things that we have at GP Energy Tech. We talk about a zero positive philosophy. So that being zero carbon and a positive impact anywhere we operate, be it manufacturing, sales network, or whatever. And we are really trying to stop being the bad guy, as we like to say. We always say the battery is the bad guy. And we want to be kind of the reference that we can actually be the leaders for sustainability and the circular aspects. I mean, we do have one of our factories, which was the first nickel based rechargeable manufacturers in the world to get platinum status, zero waste to landfill from UL. And we're still trying to figure out ways to be truly a sustainable battery manufacturer.
That's awesome. Tina, go ahead.
Hey, so really excited to hear your session, Meg. So I am Tina Singh. I work as a principal engineer for battery EPR and circularity at Toyota. Um, I'm having weird trouble trying to start my video. It's giving me like an unstable network thing, so I'm sorry I can't start my video, but really excited to hear the environmental justice side of the battery EPR world as the automotives are entering into it. We're learning a lot from the environmentals and state initiatives, and we would actually love to collaborate with making sure what we're trying to do is not increasing carbon emissions and is sustainable. So I'd love to, looking forward to hearing your session, learning from you.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I have definitely been meaning to connect with you on EPR, so very glad you're here. And to everybody, please feel free to follow up with me after this, and I have time after, and in case anyone wants to say +1. All right, can you guys see my screen? Okay, Zoom technology has evolved where I can see everybody, and also my screen is on a different tab. This is new and exciting to me, so with no further ado, let's go ahead and I'll get started on my presentation. Will I? Yes. So a bit more about me and my background. I'm a staff scientist at Earthjustice and Earthjustice Action, which is our 501(c)(4) organization. Earthjustice is a premier environmental law nonprofit in the United States. We have just around 600 employees now. And over 200 are attorneys, because most of what Earthjustice does is pro bono litigation. However, we also have a federal policy advocacy team, and that's where I sit. So I do research that advances our federal climate and energy policy, including critical minerals and supply chains and recycling, but also due to the current circumstances, data centers, transmission build out, and kind of more defensive advocacy work. A lot of my presentation will be informed more by my previous experience, which was the PhD that I did at UC Davis, which I was really fortunate to have that be super applied in the projects I worked on. So I worked with a research team at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that was characterizing a lithium resource in the Salton Sea region in Southern California. So I was doing community engagement for that team and trying to understand what the community's concerns were, what the context of the development was, and how the research could address concerns and provide information in a more accessible way, and learned a lot through that experience. And then also worked with California's AB 2832 advisory group that was identifying policy solutions for reuse and recycling policy. So a lot of insight just through those experiences and through my dissertation. But in my current role, I have gotten to learn a lot more about what it actually means to try to translate these ideas into federal policy. And then also I have some reflections on doing this work now in 2025, which is a much different situation than when I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed grad student in California 6 years ago. Almost 7 years ago now. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk about a few key concepts in environmental justice. I certainly will not adequately explain the complex history and field of scholarship and movement that is environmental justice, but there are a few principles that I have found really helpful to use as frameworks in understanding the battery supply chain that I'm going to briefly explain. I'll talk about how those apply to the battery supply chain with different examples at a global and local level, and then talk through some of the policy implications and reflect on 2025 versus the previous context for this. I know we're going to be short on time, so there may be some slides that I'm just going to skip over because I'm really curious to hear what you all think about this. So just bear with me through that. So the concepts in environmental justice that I am going to use and apply in this presentation are mainly procedural justice and distributive justice, but they all fit into this understanding that was first named as such by a scholar called David Schlosser, called trivalent justice. So when we think about just environmental justice, I think a lot of people think about distributive justice, which questions how burdens and benefits are distributed. And so for a technology, for a development, for a policy, who is benefiting from that, either environmentally or in terms of economic benefits, and who is experiencing a burden in terms of, for example, pollution or also negative social impacts. But these other two concepts are really important to understanding why we have distributively unjust outcomes. So recognition-based justice talks about whether all impacted individuals and groups are acknowledged and valued. So, who lives in the area, how do they relate to a resource or land, and what forms of participating would work for them. And then procedural justice looks at who's able to meaningfully participate in decision-making processes. And the way that, to give an example of how these all interact and kind of inform each other, is if you have a development in an area where there is a lot of inequality between different neighborhoods and different communities, the community where people have fewer resources people are going to have a harder time accessing public participation processes. They may have a harder time attending events during the day and getting time off work. It may not be in their native language. And they also may have difficulty accessing transportation. So there are a number of barriers that can prevent people from being able to participate. If that's the case, they're less likely to be able to advocate for themselves, and therefore they're less likely to be taken into consideration in the project development, which can lead to these outcomes where that kind of exacerbate existing inequality. And so I'm going to zoom in a bit more on procedural justice because research on local opposition to mining projects has found that this is often where the breakdown happens. So scholars on, I can also, I'm happy to share slides with more references on what I'm going to talk about later. But essentially, there have been many situations where a mining company, for example, has participated in benefits sharing. They think that they are doing everything right, and yet there's still local opposition to the project. And often the breakdown is in procedural justice because the community feels that they didn't have input into how things went and they were not taken into consideration. So some of the key components that support procedural justice including local knowledge in the decision making, having transparency regarding how public participation can shape the outcome. So the flip side to this is a situation where you have public comment, people take the time to show up, they voice their concerns, they share their perspective, and then the development just kind of proceeds the way it would have anyway. And this can actually undermine trust and sort of like take people backwards because now people not only feel that this development is happening without their consent, they also feel like the government or the company wasted their time. And then a third tenet that's super important and really actually quite difficult to achieve, as I have learned, is providing information that addresses people's questions in an appropriate form. So sometimes if there is a robust permitting process, as people on this call may be all too well aware, companies will spend a lot of time and money developing an environmental impact report. However, if this report is thousands of pages long, based mainly on modeling, or even presented in a technical presentation, it can be very dense and not necessarily satisfy, it's not necessarily satisfying the requirement to provide information if it's not presented in a way that addresses people's concerns and that they can actually access and understand. So procedural justice is extremely important in achieving these outcomes, and I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that. I think, on an individual level, environmental justice and considering environmental justice as we develop a new supply chain is important in terms of the type of world I want to live in, and one where people have clean air and water, and when we are addressing rather exacerbating income inequality. But it's also important in order to facilitate community buy-in and community support for a project. And we have seen and continue to see issues where, or cases where there's a battery factory, for example, that gets pretty far down the line of getting permits, getting approval from city council, and the community, if they don't feel, if they want to, they can create a lot of problems and stop the project. So it is very important to get buy-in. And I think trying to achieve that by practicing environmental justice rather than kind of checking boxes of did you do outreach and did you hold a community meeting is a more effective strategy. Okay, now applying to this perspective to the battery supply chain, I'm going to start at a really high level. So I'm sure we've all seen this graphic a million times or some version of this graphic a million times. Usually when I have seen it, this one in particular, I borrowed from Redwood Materials. Usually it's used to show how much production is concentrated in China, or it's used to show the geographic distribution of the supply chain and how spread out it is and why we need to have more domestic mining and production and manufacturing. I also want to use it in this case to look at where some of the burdens and benefits are distributed for the battery supply chain globally, just to look at kind of as a first case study of applying this logic to the battery supply chain. So if we think about the environmental burdens, a lot of that will be ecological destruction from mining or pollution from manufacturing processes. Some of the environmental benefits are cleaner air in areas where there will be more EV uptake. And in a status quo supply chain, a lot of the environmental benefits are going to be experienced in countries and communities that historically have been exploited for their natural resources with very little benefit. And then meanwhile, the environmental benefits of EVs specifically will be in wealthier importing countries. This picture is getting complicated now. I think China is kind of complicating this picture as being both a producer and communities experiencing the burden and being a major consumer of EVs. And then you also have a lot of countries, including Indonesia and Chile, working on developing their own manufacturing industries and kind of trying to capture the economic benefits of materials. So it's becoming complicated, but it is important that to seek to guide it on a more equitable trajectory. For local considerations, you would want to look at the local environmental and public health impacts, what are potential impacts and what measures are being put in place to mitigate them. You'd want to look at community and workforce benefits. So this could look like tax agreements. This could look at like workforce training programs that are put in place to ensure that local residents are eligible to get access to job creation. And then you also want to look at public participation, like I mentioned before. And then some of the environmental justice issues applied to the end of life. Safety, always a concern with batteries, or it's always something to keep front of mind. Another kind of unique consideration when you're using an environmental justice lens is the potential burden of end-of-life management if recycling poses a cost to the owner of the battery, and particularly for owners of used EVs, where if that's presenting an additional cost and you already likely have fewer resources to address it. And then also the recycling process itself is extremely important for environmental justice in terms of providing an alternative source of mineral supply, but disposal and recycling processes themselves also need to be responsible and practiced in an environmentally sustainable way. Globally, this is a concept that I was recently introduced to called waste colonialism. This is the idea that colonialism does not only necessarily mean resource extraction and exploitation, but also dumping waste on countries that don't have the capacity to handle them safely. And this is a potential issue for used EVs and used batteries. If we are exporting EVs to countries where it's very difficult for anybody to repair them due to software access, and there's just the difficulty of repairing EVs, and then they may be processed and recycled or just abandoned in ways that are unsafe and creating additional hazards for communities. Okay, actually, we're doing okay on time, but I will try to wrap it up so we have time for a few questions. I'm going to talk through some of the high-level solutions that kind of emerge when you're approaching this topic from this angle, and then some of the policy levers to achieve them, mainly at the federal level, but I can also talk about what they have been trying to do in California if people are interested in that. So demand reduction is generally the first solution that we talk about. And by demand reduction, I mean reducing the demand for new mining. So this doesn't necessarily mean we are going to eliminate demand for new mining anytime soon, but by employing these strategies that limit the pace of new demand, it enables us to have more control over where we source materials from. So instead of saying, regardless of what the impact of this mine is, we have to have the minerals now, and therefore none of these considerations can be taken into account, we can kind of make better use of the materials we already have and try to be more selective. So a few solutions here are overall like supporting public transit and policies that provide alternative mobility options for people, maximizing the material efficiency, for example, through denser battery design, maximizing reuse and recovery. And there's a few recent studies from ECS and RMI that have looked into how much pursuing these strategies could reduce demand for raw materials in the future. On the production side, some choices that can be made there include using lower toxicity materials. For example, avoiding PFAS chemicals is a big one at the moment. Improving water and efficiency in the production processes so that the manufacturing is not straining local resources. Powering manufacturing with clean energy to avoid additional pollution from the manufacturing. And then also, in the case of EVs, I'm still adjusting to the current times, but producing more affordable vehicles so that the technology is also, and the benefits are accessible to more people. Going back to procedural justice, the siting and planning process is extremely important. One solution that that I think is really important, although not widely practiced, is proactively monitoring environmental impacts. The reason I think this is so important is because particularly when you have a novel technology, you can't really say for certain this is what the impact will be. You can't point to another development or another factory that used this technology and say, look, they're doing this in this region and it has had no impact. So in order to really build trust and address community concerns about public health impacts, proactively monitoring is really the best way, particularly for novel technologies. And then the other thing I want to talk about here is just the importance of allocating more time and resources to community engagement. It does take time. If you don't take time to do it, it may backfire. And I think also having a plan to incorporate the feedback so you're not just coming in and saying, hey, this is going to be the best thing that ever happened to you, and here's why. You're really understanding the community and being able to design the project with what they say in mind. And then on end-of-life management, some really key considerations are having batteries that are designed for reuse and repair, providing transparent information about the remaining capacity. So this facilitates more effective reuse. It also can be instrumental in preventing, for example, waste dumping, and just generally making sure everybody who's involved in this system has the information they need to know whether to buy a battery and what to expect when they get it. And then financing mechanisms or an extended producer responsibility that will provide some mechanism to address burdensome end-of-life batteries, whether they're a burden because because it's an LFP battery and the materials are not valuable enough for a recycler to pay for them, or because they're in a remote location, or because they're damaged and the transportation cost is going to exceed the value of recycling. Some of the federal policy levers to achieve these aims are tax credits and grant programs, technical assistance in research, and permitting and environmental protection. For tax credits and grant programs, we heard a bit about this in the keynote, but this is a major way that the US government typically encourages technological innovation and industries that they deem to be in the public interest. So in order to design these types of policies with environmental justice in mind, you would first prioritize some of the projects that are advancing some of the solutions I spoke about before that address equity issues. And it can also be achieved in the how of how the policy is designed. So that would be including requirements or incentives for projects that are receiving federal funding. So for example, in the IRA, as we just heard, and I guess the community, some of these provisions still exist in OB3, but having a project be required to meet labor standards or be building in an energy community in order to receive bonus tax credits was an example of an attempt to incorporate environmental justice into a maybe seemingly unrelated type of project. Another example in the from the last administration was that the Department of Energy required applicants to include a community benefits plan that was evaluated as part of their application. So this is not necessarily enforceable. And some of the community benefits plans were much more specific and well thought out than others. However, I think that just giving applicants the time and resources to think through and have to write about who lives in this community and how are we going to design our project in a way that creates more meaningful benefit was extremely valuable. And I hope that the progress will be able to continue down that front eventually. Okay, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of skip these. I'll say for technical assistance and research, a lot of the bills that we see being proposed, particularly in the critical mineral space right now, are like directing some agency to do a study about how to build the supply chain. When we see bills like that, there's some low-hanging fruit that can be used to make these policies more equitable. Often they require the secretary to consult with academia and industry. So an easy edit to make these policies more equitable is to require them to consult with tribes and tribal organizations as well when they are developing their reports and making policy recommendations. Okay, this is a delicate topic, but permitting does play an important role in protecting communities from environmental impacts and facilitating public participation. There is a need to have permitting processes that move good projects forward quickly and hold harmful projects accountable. That is a piece of the story. It's not lost on me that it has been pretty much everything I just discussed, what you could kind of feed to Doge to Control F, and then those would be all of the projects that have gotten canceled in the last year. So it has been a difficult time to be working on this. However, I still think climate change is an issue that's not going away. I think companies and the people who work at companies generally want to be pursuing positive projects. And then another thing that I've been inspired by is talking to environmental justice leaders. This is not a new situation for them. They have been fighting this fight for decades and under very difficult political conditions. And so for people like myself who are maybe new to this and started working on it during a time when there was a lot of positive momentum, it's very disheartening, but it has been important to remember that we have a lot to lose due to all of the progress that was made in the last administration. And that's a result of people continuing to advocate for themselves and what they believe in, even when it was not politically popular to do so. So yeah, in conclusion, using environmental justice as a lens can help at a high level inform different solutions and technological solutions to prioritize, but also how the implementation follows. Community engagement is key to that. And I think following these things, regardless of what we call it and what the political rhetoric surrounding it is, can lead to win-win outcomes and build lasting trust. And I will stop there. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this and how, like whether you talk about this in your own work and just generally any reactions that you have.